It's Friday, it's 12:15 and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights from across the UK. I'll be joined by colleagues in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Sean Curran. This week, as inflation hits a 40-year high, this from the Governor of the Bank of England.
I'm afraid the one that I am going to sound, I guess, rather apocalyptic about is food.
The Prime Minister faces calls to introduce a windfall tax on energy producers.
Working people across the country can't afford to wait while he vacillates. It's time to make his mind up.
Nothing could be more transparent from this exchange than their lust to raise taxes on business.
After Boris Johnson visits Northern Ireland, the government says it will make changes to the Brexit deal he signed.
How can any international partner or how can any citizen in the north of Ireland ever trust this government again?
This is a trade war to crush business in Northern Ireland.
And the Levelling Up Secretary suggests moving the House of Lords out of London, but peers don't want to move to Stoke or anywhere else.
Does he not realise this is not a matter for the government, as my noble friend has told us, or was this just another freelance exercise by an intellectual flibbertigibbet?
More on that later, but let's start here in Westminster with Sean Curran on another story. The dominant issue has again been the cost of living. And earlier this week we heard, as we did in the headlines there, from the Governor of the Bank of England. How has the week unfolded here in Westminster?
Well, as you say, the cost of living has really become the number one political issue, and it ran all through the week. The start of the week was interesting. Andrew Bailey, he's the Governor of the Bank of England. Now, he and his officials, they make regular appearances before groups of MPs on the Treasury Committee, where they talk about the economy and the decisions they've taken. This week, at the very start of the week, I think was probably one of the most awaited appearances because he was under a lot of pressure, not least because, of course, it's his job to keep inflation under control. It's supposed to be 2%. That's the target. And as we now know, a couple of days after his appearance, we got the latest figures which showed that last month in April, inflation had hit 9%. So he was under pressure there. But he was also under pressure because there had been reports in the days leading up to his appearance that some Conservative MPs, perhaps even some ministers, were not happy with the way the Bank of England had reacted to the crisis, and there was even some question about the Bank of England's independence. So just as ministers have been under the cosh over their handling of the cost of living crisis, here was a governor who was also facing political pressure as well. And so there was a lot riding on this appearance, and it has to be said, he didn't come with good news for the committee.
I wonder if you could just comment on the assertion that many are beginning to make now, that you've really been asleep at the wheel, you should have done far more on the monetary side far earlier in order to get on top of this inflation. We shouldn't be in the position that we are in at the moment. This could have been avoided had you been smarter at what you've done.
I do see comments around hindsight, and obviously we have to take decisions based on how we see the facts and the evidence at the time.
I want to talk about the future and your future projections for inflation. Governor, what do you see as the main risks to your projections going forward?
I'm afraid the one that I am going to sound, I guess, rather apocalyptic about is food. I have to tell you that, I think this is a big concern because I think two things that the Ukrainian finance minister said. One is Ukraine does have food in store, but it can't get it out at the moment. Two, while he was optimistic about crop planting, as you know, Ukraine is a major supplier of wheat, major supplier of oil, cooking oils. And he said, he was pretty optimistic about planting, interestingly, but he said at the moment, we have no way of shipping it out. as things stand at the moment, it's getting worse. And that is a major worry, and it's not just, I have to tell you, a major worry for this country, it is a major worry for the developing world as well. And so if I had to sort of, sorry for being apocalyptic for a moment, but that's a major concern.
Okay. Have you felt a bit helpless through this period? Well,
yes, I mean, it is very, very, I mean, more than uncomfortable. I'm trying to think of a word that's even more severe than that. I mean, it's a very, very difficult place for us to be in. I mean, to predict and to forecast 10% inflation and then say, as we were saying a few minutes ago, and there's not a lot we can do about 80% of it, I can tell you, it is an extremely difficult place to be in. I mean, we have to recognise the reality of the situation that we face.
And difficult situation, the theme of which, the cost of living, continued throughout the week, as you say. And Labour tabled an amendment to the Queen's Speech, which is the government's legislative agenda, which was still being debated this week. What was that all about?
Yes, so the Queen's Speech was the big occasion to mark the opening of Parliament, and it's when the government sets out its legislative agenda. It's its plans, really, for all the legislation it wants to pass between now and probably this time next year. But the debate does go on for quite a long time, and there are different topics debated on each day. Labour had come up with an amendment which basically said, we regret that your plans did not include the proposal for a one-off windfall tax on the profits being made by oil and gas companies. Now, of course, this has been Labour's big policy proposal to tackle the cost of living for some months now, and this was another opportunity for Labour to force the issue. But it's not just they wanted to force the issue, they wanted to really highlight the pressures that they know exist within the government and the Conservative Party, because they know that there are senior figures in the government who are opposed to a windfall tax, and there are others, like Rishi Sunak, who have suggested, well, we're not ruling it out altogether. So it made for an interesting debate where you saw Labour putting forward their proposal and you saw some of those tensions coming forward from the Conservatives, and perhaps the impression given that it might come at some point, but not just yet.
These profits are unearned, unexpected, and the British people are paying for this windfall. These companies are not profiting from decisions they have made, risks they have taken, wealth they have created, but from a global spike in prices to which Britain is badly exposed, exacerbated by Putin's invasion of Ukraine. What is the principle the government is defending here? What is their hill to die on? I think a massive U-turn is lumbering slowly over the hill. But I say this to the Chancellor: swallow your pride and get on with it.
I do think there's no recognition from the other side of the £22 billion the government put in to help with the cost of living, particularly with the 5p cut in fuel duties. But I just asked my honourable friend that the oil companies are not passing the cuts to the pumps. They don't reduce the price. They take ages to reduce the prices when the international oil price falls. The oil bosses are earning multi-million-pound salaries and getting multi-million-pound bonuses. They are, in essence, in my view, the new oligarchs.
We are going further. In October, a further discount on energy bills worth £200, and in just a few weeks' time, a massive tax cut for workers when the national insurance threshold is increased to £12,500. But we are pragmatic, and what we want to see are energy companies who have made extraordinary profits at a time of acutely elevated prices, investing those profits back into British jobs, growth and energy security. But as I have been clear, and as I have said repeatedly, if that doesn't happen soon and at significant scale, then no option is off the table.
A survey of nearly 300 people in Glasgow, 24% were self-disconnecting or rationing their heating. There are real heart-rending individual stories behind this. People relying on candles, using hot water bottles and just living in misery.
Firstly, in terms of protecting consumers, it's an unorthodox approach to suggest that reducing prices in the sector is best served by whacking a tax on the producers. It is very difficult to see how this would result in prices being reduced in the sector. Now, of course, we have the price cap, which would help in some respects, but it is without the proper controls, it is very difficult to see how this wouldn't ultimately be passed on to consumers.
There was nothing in the plan for the people who are facing a crisis today. There was no empathy for those people, and there was no understanding from the Chancellor of the difficulty that they are facing.
Despite the heated debate, Sean, if you excuse the pun, the Labour motion was defeated.
It was, yes. The government won that vote, so the amendment didn't go through. But, of course, the arguments continue.
Indeed, over windfall tax on energy companies. That precise argument was repeated and echoed, and the cost of living at Prime Minister's questions as well.
Absolutely. We heard there Rishi Sunak kind of leaving the door open to the possibility of a windfall tax. And it was a door that Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, was very keen to walk through, perhaps march through, when he concentrated all of his questions at Prime Minister's questions on the cost of living and pushing once again the idea of a windfall tax.
1 minute they're ruling it in, the next they're ruling it out. When will he stop the hokey-cokey and just back Labour's plan for a windfall tax to cut household bills?
Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker, we will look at measures. We will look at all the measures that we need to take, Mr. Speaker, to get people through to the other side. But, Mr. Speaker, the only reason we can do that is because we took the tough decisions that were necessary during the pandemic.
On one side, the chair of Tesco, the chair of John Lewis, the chair of the Treasury Select Committee, the chair of the Education Select Committee, Lord Hague, Lord Brown, the old CEO of BP, all support a windfall tax. Even the current boss of BP says it wouldn't discourage investment. And on the other side, the member for North East Somerset, when he's not sticking notes on people's desks like some overgrown prefect, is dead set against it. When is he finally going to get a grip, stand up for the people of Britain and get on the right side of the argument?
Mr. Speaker, nothing could be more transparent from this exchange than their lust to raise taxes on business. Mr. Speaker, we don't relish it. We don't want to do it. We don't want to do it. Of course we don't want to do it. We believe in jobs and we believe in investment and we believe in growth.
The Tories' only response to this cost of living crisis has been insults and inaction. The Tory backbencher who thinks poor people just need cooking lessons. Yep. The Tory minister who thinks that people should just get a better paid job. And the Chancellor who thinks it would be silly to act now. This is the cost of living crisis from Westminster. If this Chancellor won't deliver an emergency budget, it's time for the Prime Minister to sack the Treasury, to sack the Chancellor and to put somebody else in office that will act.
We've been through COVID. We're facing a spike in global energy prices, which has been greatly exacerbated by what Putin is doing in Ukraine. But to deal with it, of course, what we're doing is putting billions and billions already, 9.1 billion, into supporting people with the cost of energy. Cut fuel duty by record sums, Mr. Speaker, helping elderly people in all sorts of ways, not least through local councils with another £1 billion.
Boris Johnson there answering questions at PMQs. I suppose the question to you, Sean, is where is the government on windfall tax? Some are for, some are against in the cabinet.
They are split, and we've seen some ministers speaking quite openly. The Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, saying that she was in favour of low taxes. We heard Rishi Sunak there saying that nothing's off the table. And we heard Boris Johnson there, I think, trying to say, yes, in principle, we don't want to raise taxes, and then being jeered by Labour, of course, because of what has happened over the last few years. But then on the issue of the windfall tax, he didn't close the door completely. So I think we could say that at the moment they are undecided. It's definitely true that there are some members on the Conservative benches and some members in the government who do not want to see a windfall tax and do not think it will help, but it may well happen all the same.
We'll come back to you in a few moments' time. Let's find out what's been happening in Holyrood this week with our correspondent there, Jenny Davidson. Hello to you, Jenny. Trains have been in the news in Scotland this week, makes a change from ferries, with the announcement on Wednesday of major cuts to services by ScotRail from Monday. And that came up at First Minister's questions too, didn't it?
Yes, it did, with questions from both the Conservative and Labour leaders on this. Now, it follows an announcement by Scotland's national train operator ScotRail on Wednesday that there would be cuts of nearly 700 services a day from next week, with further cuts expected probably to weekend services as well. Now, this is due to a shortage of train drivers because of a pay dispute. Train drivers are now refusing to do overtime, refusing to work on rest days, and we're seeing the dependence the services now have on that overtime. What we're seeing is that many services are going to be ending early evening, very few late night and late evening services, which is going to impact on travellers. And this is quite awkward for the Scottish Government, because ScotRail was just nationalised a few weeks ago on the 1st of April with the aim of improving services. Now, Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister, said that the situation was regrettable, but with the announced cuts, that would give certainty to travellers rather than unplanned cancellations. But Conservative leader Douglas Ross said there would be an impact not just on individual travellers, but also on businesses.
Take just one example. From Edinburgh to the Deputy First Minister's constituency in Perth. You won't have to leave an hour earlier, not 2 hours earlier, but more than 3 hours earlier. The last train from Edinburgh to Perth is now going to be at 8 o'clock instead of 18 minutes past 11 at night. And, Presiding Officer, that's just one example. On train services right across Scotland, the last train is being brought forward by hours. And this will have a profound impact on businesses, restaurants, bars and clubs. And this is a quote from the Nighttime Industries Association just this morning, who have called the cuts to these services, and I quote, "another cruel blow." They go on to say that it will put at risk both Scotland's economic recovery and the future of many thousands of small businesses and jobs.
This temporary timetable, while of course it is regrettable that it is necessary, is designed to give more certainty to passengers for the short term, rather than have what we saw at the weekend, which was unplanned cancellations. So it is disruptive, it's not acceptable, it must get back to normal as quickly as possible. That is why we must see all parties get round the table and negotiate a fair and an affordable pay deal, but also that ScotRail must continue the work that it is already undertaking to train more drivers. There are already more drivers working for ScotRail than was the case in many previous years, but to train more drivers so that that reliance on rest day working is reduced and eventually eliminated.
There's going to be pressure on the Scottish Government to get this resolved as soon as possible, but Union ASLEF has also accused the Scottish Government of getting involved in industrial relations and political interference, and it's asking to be left in peace to negotiate directly with ScotRail. So there's also going to be a fine balance to follow there as well.
Jenny, education has already and also been discussed this week, I should say, specifically around work to close the gap in educational attainment between pupils from richer and poorer backgrounds. What specific issues were raised?
Well, yes, as you say, it's the poverty-related attainment gap. Now, this is something that the Scottish Government has always named as a key priority, education in general. Back in 2015, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, said this would be this was her priority, and she asked to be judged on that. The SNP said this would be the defining mission of the next Parliament from 2016 onwards. And they launched in 2015 a challenge, Scottish Attainment Challenge, which was a package of support that was meant to reduce that educational attainment gap between the richest and the poorest pupils. Now, among the support was extra funding for 9 councils in Scotland that had the highest number of pupils in poverty. Now, 5 years on, we're looking back at what's been achieved and looking forward to the next 5 years. Education Secretary Shirley-Ann Somerville was before the Education Committee this week. And then there was also a Labour-led debate, and that was particularly raising concerns around plans for the next 5 years, which would see the money that has gone to those 9 councils as most poverty being shared around the all 32 of Scotland's councils instead in future.
Child poverty continues, shamefully, to grow in Scotland under the SNP and the Tories. We also know the pandemic has been worst for the poorest communities. Infection rates were higher, mortality higher, school absences higher, and we know that education impact has been severe. What little statistical evidence the Government has gathered shows that the attainment gap is now wider than it has been since this policy began. But to choose now to cut, and to choose these communities to cut, beggars belief. Of the £40 billion budget, of which can be applied against, this is the #1 priority, the defining mission that you have. Putting this money back represents 0.01% of that budget. How on earth can it not be found?
Cabinet Secretary. Well, because with the greatest respect to Mr Mara, the budget is already committed within education, as it is already committed right across the Scottish Government. We do not have £43 million waiting, unallocated, to be able to take from, to actually put into this. So again, where would the money come from?
Yes, questions also were asked of Shirley-Ann Somerville, Education Secretary, about when can expect to see that gap narrowed or done away with completely, and what the measurements would be. Now, that's being pushed over more to councils. We're expecting to hear what their stretch goals, as she describes them, are going to be shortly. But now, with the end of the pandemic, with rising levels of poverty and the cost of living, there's going to be a lot of focus on this in future, probably.
Absolutely. Now, the Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, George Eustace, gave evidence to Holyrood's Rural Affairs Committee on issues relating to Brexit. What was discussed?
Indeed, a familiar face to you down in Westminster. Now, yes, various aspects of Brexit, particularly on how it would affect things like farming and fishing, the Internal Market Act and the Subsidy Control Bill, particularly questions about whether they would affect devolved areas of policy, whether there could be limits on things like farm subsidies, on environmental policies like around single-use plastic, or GM crops. Now, George Eustace said that actually there had been a lot of limits within the EU. He said that, in fact, there was more freedom, that the UK regime was more liberal and permissive than what had been the case in the EU before, and that these wouldn't put limits on areas of devolved policy beyond what was needed to maintain a single market. And of course, another issue that relates to Brexit is fishing, and that's a major industry in Scotland. So questions asked about the impact of Scotland, the UK leaving the EU on Scotland and Scottish fishing industries.
Our fishing industry has become particularly vocal about the contrast between what they were promised and what an actual existing Brexit looks like for them. For example, the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations estimates the industry to be £300 million worse off by 2026.
I've always been honest that in order to get the trade and cooperation agreement and the tariff-free trade that we wanted, in the event, yes, compromises were made, and that meant that the settlement we reached on fisheries, didn't have everything that fishing leaders would have wanted. I do understand that, but it's also important to recognise what we did achieve, and that was we do have that tariff-free access to the EU market, which is an important export market, and that's particularly important for the Scottish salmon industry. Now, then, on the catching sector. Yes, they didn't get as much additional fish as they would like, but the agreement does require the European Union to forfeit about a quarter of the quota that it had as the price for having continued access in UK waters. And although it's not as much additional quota as the fishing industry would have liked, it is it is a significant boost, and there is more to come.
And of course, another very real issue that was discussed was the Northern Ireland Protocol. Mr Eustace said that speculation around the idea of a trade war was deeply unhelpful. There was nothing the UK government was doing that should disrupt Scottish exports, but of course exporters here in Scotland will be looking to see that resolved.
Thank you very much. Jenny Davidson there at Holyrood for us. Well, Sean, Jenny mentioned the Northern Ireland Protocol. That's the other dominant story that has been rumbling on for some time and obviously continuing tensions over the protocol. On Monday, the Prime Minister went to Belfast. What happened?
Yes, well, I mean, as you said right at the start, this is the deal that really Boris Johnson negotiated. It's the idea of a post-Brexit trade arrangement for Northern Ireland so that there won't be any hard border on the island of Ireland. But, of course, it does mean there have to be customs checks somewhere. And the complaint of the DUP is that it's basically meant there's a customs border in the middle of the Irish Sea. So we had the elections just at the start of this month. The DUP got the second largest number of seats in the Northern Ireland Assembly, but they're saying they won't go back into devolved government until their concerns about the Northern Ireland Protocol are resolved. So, as you say, the Prime Minister went to Belfast to try to resolve those. During the course of his visit, he gave a number of interviews, he talked quite a lot, and he raised the possibility that the British government might change unilaterally this deal that it had negotiated with the European Union. So it might change the arrangements for Northern Ireland. Whilst the Prime Minister was in Belfast, over in the House of Lords, not very far from where we are, they were busy talking about this, and they were going through and rehearsing some of the arguments that I suspect we will hear quite a lot of over the coming months.
My Lords, the Government has engaged in negotiations with the European Union in good faith since last summer. We are asking the Commission to go back to Member States for a new mandate, but we cannot wait to fix the issues facing people in Northern Ireland resulting from the protocol. We hope the EU's position changes. If it does not, then it will be necessary to act.
My Lords, political stability and peace can only be protected through partnership and pragmatism in Northern Ireland. There has been mounting speculation about the Government's proposed intentions to override parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol against the express wishes of the majority of MLAs who were recently elected to the Assembly. So therefore, in this regard, could the Minister indicate, is this correct?
The problem we face today is that an instrument, the protocol that was designed to uphold the agreement, is now ironically undermining the agreement and threatening political stability in Northern Ireland. Witness, we've had no First and Deputy First Minister since February and no immediate prospect of having them unless something changes.
Of course, it's right that the Prime Minister is in Belfast today. But the Minister, who has enormous experience in Northern Ireland politics, knows that one-off meetings just won't solve the problem. And so it requires proper, intense, round-table negotiations with the European Union, the Irish Government, and above all, with all the political parties in Northern Ireland. So does he agree that the issue will not be solved by grandstanding, newspaper articles and megaphone diplomacy?
He will be aware that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, has been in fairly constant dialogue with the representatives of the five main Northern Ireland parties in recent days, in addition to the Prime Minister's very welcome visit today, where the objective is to try and clear some of the hurdles which are preventing the formation of an executive.
Now, the Foreign Secretary also gave a statement to the House of Commons. Sean, what did she say?
Yeah, this was really the next stage of everything we've just been hearing peers talking about. So Liz Truss came to the Commons and she said that, not that she was introducing a planned law right now, but she would introduce at some stage legislation to unilaterally change the Northern Ireland Protocol, that post-Brexit trade deal, even though she was stressing all the time that her preferred solution would be to carry on negotiating with the European Union.
To respond to the very grave and serious situation in Northern Ireland, we are clear there is a necessity to act to ensure the institutions can be restored as soon as possible. The Government is clear that proceeding with the bill is consistent with our obligations in international law and in support of our prior obligations in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And before any changes are made, we will consult businesses and people in Northern Ireland as our proposals are put forward. I want to be clear to the House that this is not about scrapping the protocol.
It is over 2.5 years since the government negotiated and signed the withdrawal agreement. That deal included the Northern Ireland Protocol, which required, by its design, some trade barriers and checks in the Irish Sea. That was clear from the outset. It was a choice by this Prime Minister, by the government. And yet now, barely 2 years later, the government is trying to convince people its flagship achievement was not a negotiating triumph, but a deal so flawed that they cannot abide by it. Either they did not understand their own agreement, they were not upfront about the reality of it, or they intended to break it all along.
The first duty of government is to uphold the law. If it tries to bob and weave and duck around that duty when it's inconvenient, if government does that, then so will the governed. And then nothing is safe, not home, not liberty, not life itself. Not my words, but Margaret Thatcher's. Respect for the rule of law, Mr. Speaker, runs deep in our Tory veins. I find it extraordinary that a Tory government needs to be reminded of that.
The statement today is a welcome, if overdue, step. That is a significant move towards addressing the problems created by the protocol and getting power sharing based upon a cross-community consensus up and running again. Therefore, we hope to see progress on a bill in order to deal with these matters in days and weeks, not months, and as the legislation progresses, we will take a graduated and cautious approach.
What we've heard from this government today is absolutely astonishing. So this morning, the government announced that they're going to ride roughshod over the wishes of victims in Northern Ireland by ripping up an international agreement called the Stormont House Agreement. Now the Foreign Secretary has confirmed that she's going to go against the majority, despite what she might say, the majority of citizens in Northern Ireland who support the protocol by ripping up an international agreement called the Withdrawal Agreement. Mr. Speaker, it's a very, very simple question, despite what some people, they might not want to listen to the majority of people in Northern Ireland. It's a very simple question. How can any international partner or how can any citizen in the north of Ireland ever trust this government again?
Foreign Secretary.
In response to the honourable gentleman, an overwhelming proportion of people in Northern Ireland, 78%, agreed that the protocol needs to change in polling conducted in December 2021. So it's simply not true to say a majority of people in Northern Ireland support the protocol.
This is a power grab. People talk about a trade war. This is a trade war to crush business in Northern Ireland. Will the Foreign Secretary ensure that whenever she's speaking to the Cabinet, that they know clearly that if they keep the protocol, power sharing isn't coming back?
Salutary warning there from Ian Paisley. And the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss was asked, I think on a couple of occasions, when such legislation might be introduced, and she just said in the coming weeks. Let's go to our reporter Cemlyn Davis, who can tell us what's been happening in the Welsh Parliament. Hello, Cemlyn. There were fiery exchanges in the Senedd during a debate about health services in North Wales. Tell us about it.
Yes, in the Betsy Cadwaladr Health Board area, a health board that's been under the spotlight for the wrong reasons for many years now. This week, Health Inspectorate Wales published a damning report into services at the A&E department at Ysbyty Glenclwyd Hospital in Denbighshire. It found that patients, including those with mental health issues and some presenting with suicidal intentions, had faced lengthy waits to be seen, and that some had actually walked out and left without being assessed. And the report said that significant improvements are now needed. And all this led, as you say, to very angry exchanges here in the Senedd on Wednesday.
Do you not agree, Minister, that the time has now come for the Welsh Government to start a wider conversation around reforming health services in the north of Wales? They say if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, do you know what? It is broke and it needs fixing.
If your answer
is to restructure at a time when people are waiting for operations. You want the whole health board to be thrown up in a tiz at this point in time when, frankly, I want to get on with the job of healing people. You think that restructuring is going to be the answer at this point in time?
I think it's important the Minister answer without interruptions, please.
Restructuring at this point in time is not the answer.
Do you accept that the decision that was taken by your predecessor, who sat right next to you in the chamber and has been smirking during this question, you have been smirking during this question, do you accept that the decision which he
Can I hang on a second, everyone, please? We need to be, Darren, wait a second. We need to be careful of the language being used in this chamber on all sides, please. So let's make sure the questions are focused on the issue which is being raised today, and let's keep to those questions on the issue.
The question is on the issue. Do you accept that the person who is sat next to you, your predecessor, took the wrong decision when he decided to remove this health board from special measures in advance of the last Senedd election? That was the wrong decision, Minister, and you need to sort it out.
Well, the Health Minister did acknowledge during that debate that the situation was unacceptable. She also said she'd spent the day recently at Glenclwyd Hospital where she'd found staff in tears because of the pressure they were under. And she said it's important that those members of staff are given the support they need. As for the Health Board, well, it says that it accepts this report and that it must and will do better.
Well, that was something of a row there in the Senedd, Cemlyn. Moving on, there was a powerful contribution during a separate debate this week from one member of the Senedd who spoke about her anorexia when she was younger.
Yes, that's right. Labour MS Sarah Murphy was contributing to a debate about child and adolescent mental health services in Wales when she spoke about having anorexia when she was 14 years old. This is what she had to say.
My mum actually told me something she never told me before, which was that my paediatric consultant at the time wrote to my counsellor, didn't even tell my parents this, didn't give them the heads up, that I was 2 days away from them admitted me to the adult psychiatric ward at East Glamorgan Hospital when I was 14. They would have locked me up in the adult psychiatric ward at East Glamorgan Hospital. I would never have come out. I would never have come out. So the only other solution, the only other option at the time was a residential unit that was in Bristol, and it was full. And my parents were just, so scared, so scared. I think, to be honest, I was so unwell. I don't even think I was scared anymore. I didn't know what was going on. I did recover, and I'm a very rare, like you look at the statistics, it's very rare to recover from this. And I did. And I can't even really tell you how I did, even now. But I just wanted to say that was 20 years ago, and we still don't have a unit in Wales.
Well, responding to those comments afterwards, the Welsh Government said that every health board in Wales had received extra funding to improve eating disorder services, which continue to be a priority.
Well, that was very moving. Cemlyn, there was some discussion too about an upcoming visit to South Wales by the controversial evangelist from the United States, Franklin Graham.
Yes, this came up during FMQs on Tuesday when Plaid Cymru's leader Adam Price expressed concern that Franklin Graham would be holding an event in Newport on Saturday in a venue that's partly owned by the Welsh Government. Let's hear a little bit of what he had to say about this.
The Wales International Convention Centre is this month hosting the televangelist Franklin Graham, who was called gay men and women the enemy, who are here to devour our nation, who's even praised Vladimir Putin for his homophobic policies. Now, Mr Graham may be entitled to his homophobic beliefs, but he's surely not entitled to be provided with a stage to air them at a convention centre that is 50% owned by the Welsh Government.
We do not run that centre, and it's for those who are responsible for it to make those decisions. I'm sorry to see a person of those views given a platform to express them here in Wales, and they absolutely do not reflect anything that the Welsh Government would be prepared to endorse or sanction.
Well, the venue itself has said this week that it has received assurances that Franklin Graham won't be speaking out against any particular person or any particular group. During that same exchange as well, between Adam Price and Mark Drakeford, we heard tributes to the footballer Jake Daniels, who came out as being gay earlier this week. Both Mr Price and Mr Drakeford said that they hoped that would give courage to other people to follow in his footsteps, Joe.
Kemlyn Davis, thank you very much there at the Senate. Sean, we've got time for one more story, and this is a row over temporarily relocating peers while work continues on the Palace of Westminster.
That's right. The Palace of Westminster is crumbling. There's bits of masonry falling off.
I know. Dangerous.
There's a big risk. We're always told of fires. There have been a number of fires in recent years. So there's a big project of repair and renovation that needs to be done, and it's a row that's been going on for years, and the discussion has really been on, well, how do we do this? Does everybody have to move out, or can we carry on with people there? About 6 years ago now, the House of Lords started to make plans that it would move out once this work began, and they would go to the Queen Elizabeth Conference Centre, which is about, 200 yards away from the House of Lords. Then at the weekend, Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Secretary, said that he was planning to block this proposal because he gets to control that site, and instead he suggested that peers should move out of London, and he had some suggestions. And I think it would be fair to say that it didn't go down well in the House of Lords.
My Lords, restoration and renewal is a parliamentary programme, and decisions on how to proceed are for Parliament. Both houses are reviewing the programme's shape, and the Commissions will jointly consider options and seek a revised mandate from both houses.
I'm most grateful to my noble friend. So can we take it that Mr Gove was off doing his own thing at the weekend when he wrote to the Speaker on Friday evening to indicate that the Queen Elizabeth Centre would not be available for us? Would the government be kind enough to ask him to put the analysis in the library of how he thought this would enable Parliament to function if one house was sent to Stoke or someone else?
Well, my Lords, I won't be tempted to follow speculation about what might have been the motives of a colleague in the government in relation to a particular letter. I mean, the Secretary of State is always inventive. But, my Lords, I will repeat what I've said, that these are matters for Parliament.
We have heard this all before, and there are dozens of us waiting to give suggestions of our home city, where it would be lovely to be. Might I make a recommendation to Norwich? Any city that boasts proudly that it used to have a pub for every day of the year would probably be the good environment for suggestions such as this.
I declare the interest of having been brought up in Burnley. Would the noble Lord care to remind Mr Gove that we are one Parliament, not two, and therefore dividing the two houses would be a very adverse and unconstitutional act. And therefore, if he wants Parliament to be in Burnley, it should be both houses and not one.
My Lords, my noble friend is playing an admirable straight bat, on which I congratulate him. But on whose authority did Mr Gove contact the Lord Speaker or the Speaker or anyone else? Was he speaking for the government? And if so, does he not realise this is not a matter for the government, as my noble friend has told us? Or was this just another freelance exercise by an intellectual flibbertigibbet?
Well, my Lords, I couldn't possibly comment on that as...
Very wise. I don't think Michael Gove will be welcome in the House of Lords anytime soon, and the story of the restoration and refurbishment of the Palace of Westminster will no doubt continue to rumble on. That's all for this week's roundup of parliamentary news from across the UK. Thank you to Sean Curran for joining me here and all our correspondents. I'll be back with Politics Live on Monday at 12:15. Until then, have a very good weekend.